Do you have to do the
to do it over.
Oh,
I'm sure that somebody up there
Okay.
has the...
You're on now.
My name is Beverly Sanders, and today is Friday, January 10th, 2014. I'm visiting with Jerry Burris in McFarland Memorial United Methodist Church in Norman, Oklahoma. This interview is for the historical records of McFarland United Methodist Church, as well as the Voices of Oklahoma United Methodism project of the Oklahoma Conference Oral History Research Program, which is coordinated through the Commission on Archives and History with the support of the Oklahoma United Methodist Historical Society. Jerry, we certainly appreciate your coming this morning, taking some of your time to come and talk with us and share your knowledge of things that happened at McFarland with us. So would you just take a minute and tell us a little bit about yourself and your connection to McFarland?
well, thank you for inviting me over. I came to McFarland in 1975. I was a teacher. I was working in Colorado. And I wanted to go back to school and get my master's in library science over at OU. So I came down to Norman. It was in March, spring break, and I remember I needed a part-time job and a place to live, and there was an ad in the paper.
It was in the Norman paper
transcript. And they were looking for a custodian and possible living situation. So I came up and interviewed, and what they wanted is they wanted a part-time custodian, and they had a place, a little apartment upstairs that I could live, and that would be part of my compensation. And it was like a perfect situation because I'm only, 3 blocks from the campus, so I could walk to school. And so I took the job, and I interviewed right there on the spot, and got the job that day. And was moved in June.
So you got the job immediately?
I did.
They hired you on the spot?
Hired me on the spot. I told them I'd have to go back to Colorado and pack things. And we were about to finish up our school up there, so I had finished that school year. But I came down, it was June before I got back down here with all my stuff and moved in.
I think you've already answered my next one, which was why this job was interesting to you.
It was perfect for a student at the time. That's why I took it. Yes.
And you've already told us that you were getting ready to move down here from Colorado.
Colorado. I wanted to attend library science school and become a librarian, which I did.
Did you go to work for the Norman Public Schools immediately, or did that come later?
Yes, and yes and no. I went through my graduate program, and I first started as a medical library assistant over at the Veterans Hospital. And I realized pretty quickly that my scientific mind didn't quite fit that. So I had an offer at the Norman Public School since I have a degree in education, and so I got a job as a librarian in an elementary school.
Okay. Which elementary?
Adams Elementary School. And I was there for a couple of years, and one of the, of course I'm still living here, and one of our members, Don Vickberg, a very nice man, was the principal over at Longfellow Middle School. And he said, I need a librarian. And so I moved over to Longfellow with Don for about 5 or 6 years.
Was this the first that you had, first time that you had actually been in Norman or lived in Norman?
I'd been into Norman for visiting friends. I had some friends who lived here. I just like anybody else, come up to a game, and Norman was a good place to visit, and I knew it was a nice town. So and I did have some friends living here, so I wasn't totally a stranger.
So what was your impression then of living in Norman and of living in the church McFarland?
Well, I liked living in McFarland. I really enjoyed it. But what really struck me, I liked the fact that they had retained the old building, and it was so beautiful. That sanctuary was so beautiful and well kept. The building was old and well kept, and I like an antique type things, and it was just a perfect place to live. And at the time I moved in here, there were trees around and lots of neighbors, and of course a lot of that's gone now. You know,
You mean talking about like the trees across the street
yeah,
there?
we didn't have nearly as much parking lot. There was houses and trees and a lot of students in the area, so it was a very interesting neighborhood.
Anything in particular other than being hired on the spot that you remember about your interviews? Who was in charge of the interview, and how many people, and who all was in on that?
Well, Bob Carlisle was the man in charge of the program director at the time, and he interviewed me. And I remember he asked me if they wanted me to stay at least 3 years and to commit for 3 years. And at that time, I was pretty mobile, and I thought, I'll get my degree in a year and I'll be out of here. I couldn't do that. I couldn't agree to 3 years, but I ended up staying a lot longer.
And what was it that changed your mind?
I just got comfortable. I got a job with Norman School System, and so I could do that job and this one both. And one thing led to another, and I just ended up staying.
During that time when you, like say, you just ended up staying, did you still have in the back of your mind that you would move on eventually, or were you?
Well, for a while I did until the roots got too deep. You know, I'd always wanted to go back up to Colorado. I love that.
What part of Colorado?
Well, I like. I've got relatives in the Pueblo area and over around Canyon City. And I love the mountains, but one thing led to another, and I just ended up staying here.
You liking that part of Colorado? Are you a hiker or backpacker or anything?
At the time, I liked to hike. I used to love to hike, and I'd go out through all the national parks over there. Beautiful country, but too expensive for me now.
Give us a little bit of what sort of was your job description then once you were here living in the church and getting going on? How would you describe the things that you needed to do?
The original job was basically a custodial job. At that time, we didn't have, it was a larger building, and the upstairs, the third and fourth floor, were mainly classrooms that we used once a week or so.
Yeah.
And my job was upstairs custodian.
Were you? Oh, sorry, you already answered. I started to say, were you the only custodian?
No, I was just a part-time custodian. And there was another young man who worked the downstairs part in the main building. But my job was to just get those classrooms cleaned, and it was about a 20-hour-a-week type job. And back in those days, they didn't have carpet to vacuum. You had a polished linoleum type floor, which you had to buff with the buffer every week. Had to be buffed and cleaned and buffed. And there were a lot of
And that was where was it that you had to buff?
On the main hallways in the upstairs in the old education wing. It's all covered with carpet.
Yeah.
But I remember trying to handle that big buffer that they had an old buffer that if you didn't get it just right, it would swing you around.
Oh, yeah. I've seen those.
And you had to get the marks that it made on the linoleum. You had to get those straight.
Oh.
You couldn't just buff it anyway. You had to get them straight.
And all this time, you lived in the same little apartment.
The apartment, and it was the apartment was students had been living there, and when I moved in, we put in some different furniture, and it turned it into a pretty nice place. It's never been a really wonderful place, but
and there were students in there when you came?
There was a young man.
More than one, or just one?
I think there were two. I only met the one who was moving out. He had a roommate, and he'd already left, I think. But they had been part-time, same job I was taking over, part-time job, and it was a student, just for students, basically. It was a good place for students.
Yeah. There was some living there while Joe and I were in college in the 50s.
They say that goes back a long way, quite a ways.
Well, in fact, we have a letter from a woman, I believe she was basically called the church hostess, but she was not the cook like our later ones were. But one of the things she did, she and her husband lived in the church, and they had several students who did things for them and also lived in the church at the time. About your apartment then, how about just describing your apartment for us?
That's a tough one.
Yeah, and you did say that it did not change, it was not
It did
remodeled
not,
while you
no,
were in
it
it.
consisted basically four small rooms, and by small, I mean fairly narrow rooms, because when the building was originally built, they weren't really built, it wasn't built as an apartment. It was, those were like little ante-rooms. Each one has a door that leads into the hallway, and then they all have a door interconnecting. And the thing that struck me, that made it a real livable place, was because it had stained glass windows all on the south side. That was the main window of the church, was the south wall of the apartment, and so it really made it look a lot bigger because you had a lot of window space. And in reality, they were fairly small rooms. But when I moved in '75, they had just, maybe 2 years before that, had remodeled the kitchen area. There was a small kitchen area, and that was fairly new. And then, like I say, most of the rooms were just just a small, really not originally adapted as an apartment, but it worked fine.
And so any enlargement that was done along the way was before you came?
Yeah, I don't know of any enlargement. I mean, I don't know if it was a smaller apartment before that or not. It could have been, because all the rooms have doors that you could close them off, and you could sort of compartmentalize. But when I moved in, it never changed from the time I moved in, except they did add a closet in one room, but it really didn't change at all. It was not enlarged any.
Did you ever, and I think you probably answered this too, maybe right there at the beginning, have any doubts about being in a big building like this, often the only person here all night, or did it ever make you seem things kind of give you the willies?
There were times, normally, there's a lot of activity around, but at night when everybody's gone, you're the last one here, you can't let your imagination get away from you. At that time, I didn't have a television set, and there was one in the youth center down here, so I would go down to the youth center to watch television sometimes late at night. And I'd gone down one evening and watched one of those horror films, Lizzie Borden took an axe, whatever. And I watched that film down there, and it was about 11 o'clock. I turned off the TV, and then I had to come back through the dark building all the way back to my apartment.
No.
And for some reason, I was just expecting an axe to come out of bed. I was so glad to get back into my apartment and get the door closed.
Well, in fact, my next question was, tell us a little bit about some of the more exciting moments, making your night rounds to lock up, or on the opposite end, unlocking, going around to unlock in the morning.
Well, there were a number of different interesting times. I ran into some burglars several times.
Really?
Back in the day. This is back before we installed so much burglar alarm and cameras and so forth. I ran into burglars trying to break into the office one night, and it was about 11 o'clock, and I was, and they had already broken the. In fact, you can't tell on this door right here that they repaired it, but they had already broken into some doors and with a hammer, and I came up on them just, and I played dumb. I said, I'm just the custodian here. They were looking for some, money, and they were pretty nervous. And
how many of them were there?
There were two, and they were right over by the. Back in the day, we had some glass doors that led into the education wing, and they had pulled up a chair and they were getting ready to break that window out. And I said, guys, you'll get in trouble doing that. I said, well, we need money. We need money. And one of them said, we're drug addicts. We need money. And I looked at it, and I'm saying, well, if you know, the church has a program that would be glad to help you out tomorrow if you come back tomorrow. And they wanted to get out as much as I did, but one of them had a tire tool in his hand, and I was and I didn't know what to do. I just started talking to them, and finally I talked them down to the door, and they left and took off running. I'm thinking.
And you didn't have to call the police or anything?
At that point, I thought, well, I did call the police and report it,
sure you would.
but they were gone. It was some fast talking on my part.
I was going to say, and you managed to talk them away from the office?
Away from the office and out, yes. And I look back at that and I'm thinking, I should have just turned around and ran.
So did they tell you as they anytime along in there if they did plan on coming back for the
Well, that's what they said. Oh yeah, but they didn't, of course. But I told them, oh yes, we can help you out. We come back tomorrow and told them who to talk to and so forth. And they were all okay, sure, we were going to do that, but really it was just. We both knew we were bluffing.
Can you think of anything else?
Oh, people are always asking me if there's a ghost.
Oh,
They're always asking me if there's a ghost in the building.
Is there a story that there's supposed to be?
I don't know if there's any particular story about it, but I have to admit I did see something one time.
Tell us about that.
I was locking up, and in those days I never did turn on the lights. I just knew all the steps, but from memory, I just go through the building after dark, and I wouldn't bother to turn the lights on. I'd be locking the outside doors. And I came up through the sanctuary, at the front of the sanctuary, down at the front door entrance on the side, and I opened the door into the sanctuary, and I looked out across the pews in the dark, and in the last pew I saw someone standing there, and there was not supposed to be anybody in the building. So I closed the door, and I thought about it for a second, and I opened the door again and looked out, and there was nobody there. Well, I went on out to check, and all the outside doors were locked, and I looked everywhere, and there was no one around. But I saw what looked like someone standing right behind that last pew. And I just have to admit that it was an apparition of some kind because there was no one around.
Could you tell if it was a man or a woman?
No, but there was no way for them to escape. I mean, I only closed the door for a second, then I opened it back up again, and that apparition was gone, and there was no way they could have gone anywhere. And I've thought about that over the years. I thought, it was so strong in my imagination when I opened that door up that I actually closed the door to get behind it again. So there's somebody up there, but there wasn't anyone there. So I think that might have been a ghost. But that's the only ghost story I have.
Well, how about you? You said that you met burglars several times.
There were
How'd the others turn out?
Most of the time, I ended up calling the police, and letting the police handle it. When we put in burglar motion detectors, they would go off in the middle of the night, and I would call the police, and I don't know, sometimes you have to be careful when the police arrive, because if they mistake you for the burglar, then you have to make sure they know who you are. And so I would generally I'd stay on the telephone and talk to the dispatcher, and then the police would get here, and then I'd meet them down here, and then go through the building and look for the burglars. And we've on at least two occasions they've found people in here. But the worst thing is to confront the police if they don't know who you are. I came down the steps one night, and the police had come in, and I didn't know they were in the building because they had found one of the doors.
You hadn't called them?
No, I had not called them. This is another instance.
Incident.
And I heard a noise downstairs, and I came down those main steps, and there were two policemen there, and one of them drew his gun and pointed it straight at me. And, you know, you want to say, I'm just the piano player. You know? It's pretty scary, but I had to explain who I was. But they had come in because they had found one of the doors unlocked. And at that time, we didn't lock the doors, so they didn't know that. They didn't know that we didn't lock the doors, and so they thought the building had been left open, and it had been. That was before we started locking. And we didn't start locking this building until the late 80s, I think.
I'm thinking that sometime or other, there was some sound equipment stolen from the sanctuary somewhere along the line.
That was right early on. That we had speakers that used to have some large speakers down on either side of the organ loft there, and those disappeared. And then we've had microphones taken out of the sanctuary. We've had a number of different thefts, but that was not what prompted the need to lock up. That we had a little bit of vandalism that occurred about 1986, 87, somewhere in there. We had someone that came in the middle of the night, and we used to have a large Bible that we kept open up on the pulpit. And they got to that Bible, and they cut out the pages of the Song of Solomon, tore them out of the Bible, and that defaced the Bible. And then there was another instance where someone had broken a glass to get in the little chapel area here, and that was, those things came pretty close together, and so they decided we need to start locking up the building.
So what was the lockup time then?
Well,
officially?
about 10 o'clock in the evenings, and in the mornings, I'd have to come down. We worked to deal with the daycare, since they are here early. Then they would unlock the main doors, and then on weekends I would unlock about 7:30 in the morning, and on Sunday, of course, very early, about 7 o'clock at least. But once they changed started locking the building, that added to my job and changed my job around. And but it was all right for me because I traded out. I'd been mowing the lawn, and I said, well, now I've got to do a lot more work. And mowing the lawn, I've got allergies. Get someone else to do that, and I'll do the lockup. And that's what they worked on the deal there. And at that time, the lawn was not nearly as big as we have today. We just had a little strip of grass on either side of the building here.
So, about when did the alarm system come in with, having to have your number?
That was not until about the early 90s, and they put in the alarm system, and that created a lot more problems because a lot of people didn't know how to operate that, and they'd come in and they wouldn't get they'd forget to put the code in, and they'd set the alarm off, and I'd have to come downstairs, or the alarm company would call me, and I'd have to decide if it was a real burglar or if it was somebody who didn't put their code in properly. And then with the alarm was the fire alarm system, which went off in the middle of the night for no reason many times. Dust or something would get in the smoke detectors. So when that goes off, the fire trucks arrive. When we added all that automation,
things got more complicated.
Things got very complicated, yes.
Let's see where we were here. And then tell us a little bit about your daytime work at the Norman Public Schools. Did there ever seem to be any overlapping of that or any conflict with the...
Well,
was there ever a problem doing both jobs at the same time?
It was doing two jobs at one time, and occasionally one job would get in the way of the other one, but most of the time not. I would go to school in the morning early. I was a school librarian, and then I'd get back here by 5 o'clock or so and do evening jobs or whatever needed to be done and lock up at night. And I did that for years, and there were not many times where it was a real conflict, but occasionally something would be some kind of event at school that would keep me from being here, and I'd have to make some arrangements. But for the most part, they were pretty compatible jobs. It was kind of a night job,
It would be. Okay, let's talk about the congregation and the staff of the church. How many senior ministers were here sometime while you were here?
When I came, it was Dr. Coffin was our senior minister, and I have a story about him too.
Yeah.
And then
You want to pause? We'll go ahead and go ahead and list them, and then we'll let you go back. Because I was going to ask.
Dr. Coffin, Dr. Featherston, and then Dr. Fenn, Dick House, and then Linda Parker. I think that was.
And Linda was already here before you retired.
Yes. I think that's it. Those are all the senior ministers that we had. We had a number of associate ministers.
And remind me when you retired.
This last year.
Just last year,
March
2013.
13, yeah.
You said it was about March or so?
March. I tried to time it exactly 38 years since I took the job.
Oh, okay.
So
38 years.
38 years, yes.
Wow.
When I came, Dr. Coffin was the senior minister here, and he was a fairly aloof man, that very professional fellow. And what was interesting is that at the time I had bought a car in Denver. It was a rotary engine Mazda. They were kind of new on the market. This was a little 1973 model rotary engine. And when I got down to Oklahoma, I moved down to Oklahoma with that car, I realized that there were no dealerships in Oklahoma that dealt with the rotary engine car, the Mazda. And it had a dual carburation system that nobody knew how to tune it up. I couldn't find anybody to work on it. And so I mentioned that one time in the presence of Dr. Coffin, and what I didn't realize was that he was an old farm boy, and he liked to work on tractors and cars, and and you wouldn't have thought that. He was always dressed up and dressed, and so his ears perked up, and he said, "Well, I'd be interested in looking at that rotary engine." And I said, "Well, you're certainly welcome if you think you can tune it up." And so he said, "Well, I'll come back after church this afternoon," and it was Sunday, and he said, "Well, look at it." And so at that time, I parked across the street in the little parking lot over there that we had, and so I'm heading over there in the afternoon, and he had gone home and changed into his coveralls and brought his toolbox, and he was just excited as he could be to work on that car. He'd never seen a rotary engine, and so we had the hood up, and he was been over there working on it. And at that time, there was a little old lady who lived across the street, and she was up in years, but she was out pretty active, and so we were over there, and she came across the parking lot, and she got fairly close to us, and she started doing this and says, "You boys ought to be ashamed of yourself out here on a Sunday afternoon right in front of this church working." Well, this is the senior minister she's talking to.
Did y'all tell him that he...
No way. And she didn't recognize him. He had his coveralls on. And he said, yes, ma'am, we will move on." She turned around and left, and we just cracked up. She had no idea she was talking to the senior minister, and he said, "You boys need to be ashamed of yourself working on Sunday."
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. So he was here until about 79 or so?
Maybe, I think, is when
Or 78.
Phil Finn came in, 78, and then Phil was here for 20 years.
22 years, I think.
22 years.
Was it 22? Any stories about any of the other senior ministers? Just as a sideline here, have you by any chance read Herschel Franklin's book about the church mouse?
I have, yes. I don't fit that description.
You weren't the church mouse.
I read his story. It was kind of cute.
Well, it was a good one. But anyway, now, any stories about any of the other ministers?
Well, not really. When Phil came, let's see, I wanted to mention one thing about how the church has grown, and I remember we were setting up for Christmas Eve communion, and for the late service, Phil brought a little tape recorder and put it behind the pulpit, and we played the Christmas hymns on the little tape recorder while we had the communion service. We didn't have any choirs, and I I'm thinking, you know, today that's a very big service with
Yes.
lots of activity. But that was all he had back in those days. Just he brought a little tape recorder and put it behind the pulpit and turned it on, and that was the music for the communion.
And at that time, it was
And it was
very
adequate
until we got used to other things.
Now Dick House came, and when Dick House came, he was new to the building and everything, and he. How that worked. He ended up responding to a police call here. What happened was that he came in, he didn't get the alarm set properly. The way it would, in those days, I was out of the building, and I usually came in the back door over on the far west side, east side, and Phil had come in, Dick had come in and had not set the alarm. Well, the alarm was not set. I'll put it this way: he came in and set the alarm, thinking that he had unset it, and what it did was activate the alarm. And then he went into his office, and of course the movement set off the alarm. He thought he had turned it off, but it wasn't set to begin with, because I was out of the building and hadn't turned it on yet. So what happened then is the police came. So they figured that they were going to look for a burglar. Well, I just happened to be coming in the back door about that time, and here comes Dick with the police, and they spot me, and of course Dick said, "Oh no, he works here," you know. And it was a rather one of those awkward moments where the police had arrived by mistake again because of the burglar alarm. So he did that right on it, and from then on he never touched that burglar alarm again.
Moving on to people, some more people. Hoyt McCarty and Jean Powell were two very special ladies that worked in the offices
Very
there.
special people. Hoyt, I remember being very impressed with Hoyt's, professionalism. She was dedicated to the church, and she was very concerned about making sure there was a fresh flower in the little memorial every week. Hoyt was a very, very fine person, and then Jean Powell was. She ran the building. She ran this church, and everybody sort of cowered.
And she had told us once that she had been on every square inch of this building, including the top attic.
Absolutely, she handled all the business transactions and dealt with all the contractors and outside people that had to come in and work and so forth. And she put a lot of energy into her job. I'll never forget she also utilized me a lot. The drains got clogged up on the top of the building one time, and she talked OG&E to bring in a cherry picker and talked me into getting in the bucket of the cherry picker and going up there. And it took me way up to the top, and there was one of the drains was clogged, and I cleaned it out, but not my type of job.
So you got called on a lot of things that were not in your job description.
There was always that fine print at the bottom, and other duties as assigned, yes, and she used that a lot, yes.
Yeah, let's see, who else do you remember? I think you mentioned Tom Wilson earlier.
Tom Wilson and I can't remember his wife's name. They were a very nice couple. And, Hazel. And Tom was here every week. He was an usher, and he was a greeter at the door, and a very interesting man. Now, he was born originally in South Africa and came and worked at the university for years, and he did a lot of the carpentry type work down on the pews. Those little trays were for the communion glasses. He built all those, and Tom had a lot of stories, and he devoted a lot of time to the church. And there's been a number of people who've done that over the years.
Think of any other congregational people that we should?
Well, I always remember Tuffy McCall.
Oh yes.
He always told me how to make coffee. Making coffee was one of my jobs on Sunday morning. And Tuffy, or James McCall, had owned a cafeteria downtown, and he talked about coffee. he says, doesn't matter how, if it's good or bad, it just has to be consistent. Doesn't matter if it's good or bad, it just has to be consistent. And every Sunday morning, one of my jobs was to in the old kitchen down there, was to make several urns full of coffee and for the various classes, and they'd come in with their coffee pots and fill up, and Mr. McCall would come down and he'd check the coffee out, and we'd talk about it a little bit. It was always the same story, you know. It had to be consistent. So I tried to keep the coffee consistent as much as I could.
Let's see, who else? I didn't make a list of people.
No, I didn't. There was Brenda.
Oh, yes.
Brenda Holden was our custodian, and Phil Finn hired her. She was from England, and came over and became our head custodian, and she was here for many years until she retired. And Brenda was an interesting personality. She liked to talk a lot.
Oh, yes.
If you got around much, you had to have a lot of conversation with Brenda. But she did a lot of work here, did a lot of good things.
Yeah, Brenda was especially good to the UMW. She was very there on the spot anytime we needed anything whatsoever.
Right. She was very dedicated to her job, and you know, she finally decided to retire, and I guess that was about 3 or 4 years ago.
Quite a while.
She was here for a long time. Trying to think of other personalities.
Maybe some of the further questions might remind us of some people. McFarland was expanded starting in about 1998, I believe. We started the
Yes, they
expansion.
started building that the expansion to the east. Yes.
How did that whole project, that expansion, I believe it was finally finished and we were in the building about 2001, sometime kind of late in 2001.
Well,
how did that affect your job?
It changed it considerably, and for one thing, you know, I had been in a fairly comfortable rut, I guess, but what happened was that when they built that part, then all of a sudden there was a lot more activity, a lot more events taking place, and another part of my job was, for years I was handled the weddings and receptions here. And
the arrangements of them, or just setting up for them, or
setting up for them, tearing down, cleaning up after them, and running the sound system during it. Yeah, I did that. I did all the weddings here for many years, and for many years they didn't have a wedding coordinator, and then they hired a wedding coordinator who worked with the families and so forth, got all those details worked out. But I still had air conditioning to take care of. Get the sound and clean up the sanctuary, clean up all the rice or the bird seed that they throw outside, and then with the reception, clean up after the reception. It was quite a chore. Well, when they put the new building extension on, it added a beautiful place for receptions, and that really made it possible for the people to have a much larger, nicer reception, which it means a lot more cleanup, a lot more custodial work, and so. But the church compensated me. They realized that added a lot to the job, and and then they added the contemporary service in there, which at first Phil Finn started that, and we didn't have a place for them to practice, so they were practicing in the sanctuary. And they wanted to practice very late at night, and so they would go till like midnight or so with that very loud music, and that was right in my ear in the apartment.
Oh, yes.
Eventually, when we got the new building finished, they moved over there and did the rehearsing over there, which is made it more better.
Question just occurred to me as we're going through here. After they actually broke through the wall into where it would be the new building, what kind of security did you have of those two openings there?
Well, not a lot. They had it blocked up with plywood, and it was.
So there was nothing there to have to close up every night.
No, you just had to make sure they put plywood. They put a plywood kind of a temporary barrier on that until then when they got it finally opened up. And I don't remember a problem with that. I remember you could scoot that that plywood aside if you wanted to go on the other side, but we never had any actual break-in through there while they were building. So.
Yeah. It seemed like, as I'm recalling things, that during the early years that you were here, it seems like we almost never saw you. You managed to stay out of sight most of the time.
I did. I tried to stay out of sight. Well, actually, what it really amounted to is I had a full-time job in the day, so I was gone most of the day. And when I get back in the evening, I would only be visible to if you were up here for a meeting or something. And that's how it was. Just timing. I was just not here when a lot of people were.
Well, and on Sunday mornings, unless something went wrong that you had to come fix, we never saw you.
I was always out.
Uh-huh.
Many times back in the early days, I ran the sound for the microphones, the sound system, and that was I was always on call for that. And now I was always out around the building, but I wasn't as visible as later when we had coffee hour and I had donuts and coffee, and I started handling a lot, and that's when people started seeing me.
Yeah, that was mainly it, and I was just thinking, an awful lot of people then, when you retired, were saying, well, what's going to happen to our coffee hour?
It's still there. They still have it there. Yeah.
Not nearly as efficiently as it was, though.
Well, I did take that pretty seriously. I would prepare the coffee and get the donuts out. And that was a new job when that came around when we opened the expansion over there.
And that's just reminded me of another person to ask you about, Don Goff.
Don Goff is a phenomenal volunteer here, and I didn't know Don very well until we started doing the donuts. I realized that he's worked with the youth program. He goes on all of the trips to Mexico for the mission trips and so forth, and he's just a very good. And it does sound almost every week. Does the sound? He's a sound operator. Don is a volunteer who's people should recognize more.
And I think most people do.
Yeah.
I mean, they recognize him. They know him. I don't know that he's ever been officially recognized for all of his services. Or anything.
He goes every Sunday morning. He gets up early and goes to the donut place and picks up the donuts. He delivers them in his car here. And I would always have carts ready for him when he got outside. When we go out and put the donuts on the carts and bring them in, but he goes and gets them, and he's still doing that, I think.
Another person I just thought of that's on a kind of a different subject, back to the early years, was Sharon Ray.
Sharon Ray was our one of our I guess you call it.
Sometimes they call it church hostess, and sometimes
church hostess, I think would be the title. And that's when we used the old kitchen. That was before we got into the new building. I think she left before the new.
I believe so.
Extension.
I think she may have had something to do with planning the equipment for the new, but I'm not sure.
When I first came here, there was I guess, church hostess, cook, Lily Brule.
Oh, yes, I've always heard of her, but I never...
Now, Lily was a very, very nice lady, but she also ran that kitchen. You didn't go down and just get anything out of that kitchen that you wanted. You had to, she kept it in a lot of discipline in the kitchen, and that's good. I kept everything and just very good working for her. But I got to where I liked her. She was so efficient.
And it seems like most of the time since we've had the daycare, that there's been a separate daycare cook.
Yes.
But you probably didn't get to know them too well.
That's right. The daycare cook and the church hostess, two different jobs, two different people. And the daycare cook is there every day in the week, but not on the weekends. So.
And occasionally when our church hostess would be gone, the daycare cook would fill in.
They do fill in. It's a job. Those jobs overlap quite a bit since the daycare is in the building all the time.
Okay, I think I've already asked this. I was going to ask if the expansion created any particular problems for you. I guess we've already talked about
a number of little problems. Just for one thing, we increased activities. There are many activities now that
yes.
are not even a church function, which we just simply, it's maybe a civic organization will use the space, but they're not necessarily connected to the church. So every time there's something down there, when I was living here, you still had to be available to especially lock up after they leave. And some functions would last till 11 o'clock at night or whatever. And you had to go down, and when they're gone, make sure that, many times go down and make sure that they know how they were supposed to clean up for themselves sometimes, and maybe reset for Sunday morning. And you had to, I would have to go down and give them direction, help them out. Yes, a lot of jobs.
What about when we were having, like when mission groups would stay here at the church, or like our own youth would have their week at the church? How did things go then?
Well, that's another situation where you meet with the people who are in charge of the group, and you have a list of rules for them to follow. I typed up a nice list of, and I think that list is still up on the wall.
Oh, probably.
And the big thing would be to who locked up the building after they all were in for the evening, usually a youth group, and I would have to wait till if they had an outside something activity that they were going to, then I'd wait till they got back into the building and lock up, and then lock in the morning for them, especially on Saturday morning, so they could get out. And then I always would close the doors that led into the old section of the building, because, and that way they wouldn't be over here on these dark stairways, falling down the stairway. I was always worried about an accident over here in this part.
Do you think, I can't remember if we had groups staying here at the church before the new building.
That's a good question. I don't think we did.
He doesn't know either. So.
I
don't remember.
I don't remember a group staying here because
Well, I know for one thing we didn't have showers until the new building.
That's right. That's exactly.
I do remember they did have portable showers. They put some portable showers downstairs.
Portable
in each
showers.
room. I don't know. I think probably.
You're right. I think that
It's something up.
we started. I think when Scott Meyer became our youth director, I think we started doing some of that before the new building was built. Now that I think about it, and they would stay sometimes those big rooms up on in the education wing over there, those larger rooms at the end. I think they would sleep in there from time to time. But I don't believe before Scott. I can't remember any groups staying here in the early years when I was here.
Well, let's talk about your photography. We were talking about that just before we got ready here, and you were telling me that you are not so much taking pictures at this point, but
No, I got into that hobby back in the '80s, and I did a lot of photography. In fact, I did quite a few pictures around the building. Phil Finn used me from time to time to photograph groups and various events. But I got into it, and I started doing my own darkroom work, and I turned my little kitchen up in the apartment into a darkroom, and that was a lot of fun. But I now don't. My interest has changed to digital photography, and I like to restore old photographs now. I use Photoshop, and I've been working with some old photographs for a museum and cleaning those up on the computer.
and I was just thinking that the ones that I saw early on, your pictures were taken out with what you might call photography as art. Is there a special name for that?
I don't know. Art photography. I guess I did a lot of pictures and took them to these local events. Norman has a number of art shows during the year, and I won a number over at the Firehouse Art Station. I won first prize 2 or 3 times.
I'm remembering one you brought to school one time that I think it was on a rainy, kind of a misty, foggy morning, and you brought a picture of a spider web.
Oh yeah.
And it had drops of rain on
I
it.
still have that.
You
Somewhere.
still have? Oh, it was wonderful.
Yes.
I
I did.
was so impressed. I've always remembered that. And then you had one of the The oil pump out there that
That oil
has.
pump picture, and someone just the other day asked me about that picture. I don't have any more copies. I did my own darkroom work and printed my own pictures, and I gave them numbers, I numbered the images and sold them as art. And I did that for several years, and some of that art's still around. I use art, and some of that art is still around. If you go down to the office, there are 3 images that I did of this church that are on the wall, and I really thought those were some of my better pictures.
Well, that was, in fact, that was my next question, that, we know that had seen a lot of the different pictures. Do you have a favorite of the ones you took of McFarland?
Well, the one on the wall down there in the office, I have one that it looks as if the sunrise is coming up and the sun is hitting the front of the main part of the building here, and I photographed it from across the street through the trees, branches, and it gives the building such a nice warm look to it. That's one of my favorite shots. But to be honest with you, I had to manipulate that just a little bit in the darkroom. It didn't take that picture just directly out of the camera. But
you said there's about 3 of them down there?
there's 3 on the wall down there. There's one in a kind of a fog. Took in the fog, and I'm trying to think of the other one. The other one is that sunrise picture. And another one that I took at night with the spotlights out around the building that were shooting up to the tower. And I
remember that.
Yeah, and I took that picture at night. Those were all done with film photography back before the digital.
Are they all in black and white or something?
No, they're color.
They're
all color, and they're printed in a process called Chrome, which I did at home. It was a wonderful color process that holds the color so well. It's not, they haven't faded. Those are 30 years old or more now, and they haven't faded at all. And it's just really a very good, stable color process.
I'm thinking it'd be an entirely different thing to do in an interview, but after we finish, I'd like to go down to the office and film those pictures.
I think they're still
on the
there.
end of this tape. Let's see here. Any more memorable experiences that you'd like to get in?
Well, I was thinking about something the other day when you asked me to think about some of these things. Have you heard about the Midnight Preacher?
Midnight Preacher?
The Midnight Preacher.
That may be the question I had down here next, but go ahead and tell us.
Well, there was back in the days before we locked the building, people would come in at night, and unless they were doing anything malicious, I didn't let them stay in here. I didn't let them sleep in here, but they could sit and meditate or whatever, and I just made sure they didn't smoke or that kind of thing. But one night, about after midnight, I heard someone in the sanctuary, and I could hear from my apartment, I could hear things down at the sanctuary. And I heard someone down there talking pretty loud, and so I went out, and there was a man behind the pulpit preaching. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I listened to him a little bit. He was pretty good, actually. And so I didn't say much, I didn't say anything to him, actually. And he finally went away, and I thought, well, that's the end of that. Well, no, he started coming back pretty regularly. For quite some time. I had a midnight preacher.
Oh, for goodness sake.
And,
and about when was that?
This was maybe 85, 84, 85, something. And he would get pretty animated, and sometimes I would listen to him, and I just got used to him. I didn't ever confront him or anything. I just thought, you want to come in and preach at midnight, it's not right with me.
So you never went down and met him?
I never went down and met him because I didn't want to upset his, he thought he was by himself. And, and another situation occurred that was, my windows of my apartment will open out, and in those days there were houses right across the street, and there were a lot of students that were there. And so there was one house where they would have a party about once a week, and then all the students would be out, and the party goers would be out in the yard, and you could hear them. So I had a pretty good stereo system at the time, and I put on my stereo a record of E. Power Biggs playing the organ music. And I played that very loud one night, and they all heard it across the street. And they wanted to, it was very late, and they thought there was someone in that church playing the organ. So they all rushed over here, and of course, that's before we locked up. They came in the building. Well, as soon as they got in the building, I turned it all down. And I didn't, they looked and looked, and they couldn't find anybody.
Couldn't find the organs.
So a month or so later, they had another party. So I did the same thing. This time, they were really ready. They come over and they run around the back. They're in the alley trying to find. They can't find this organist. So I did that 2 or 3 times, and they never could figure out how that organist could get out of this building so fast, because you could tell that they had set up a plan to find that organist. They'd go all through the building, and it was so funny because they thought there was somebody over here playing the organ. I played that trick for a while.
It lasted for a long time.
Yes, to the end of the semester, they moved out, but it was. What was funny, I cranked that music up, and they finally got to the point where there were some of them would head around to the back of the building immediately. You'd hear them running around to the alley, because they thought that maybe that organist was slipping out that back door. But they never caught him.
Now, we also have heard you tell stories about some people, how you somewhat inebriated persons, you might say, downstairs down on the sidewalk out there, and playing games with them.
I've run into inebriated persons, all right. Usually, when I've had several situations where you run into people that partied too much, or I found a man down in the flower bed one morning, and you just have to try talking to them and move them on, and mainly it's a talking game.
Well, I'm thinking of a story that you told us about the voice of God speaking to one
Oh,
of them.
that was another story. Yeah. Now that story, there was definitely was an inebriated fellow on the steps, and he was looking up at the tower, and he says, "God, are you up there?" And I said, "What do you want?" He was gone. He did not expect me any kind of noise out of that church. Oh, I had a little fun back in those days.
Oh my goodness! I remember you telling us that. I think you told it at school one time.
Yes, yeah.
Probably around the.
He looked up and he said, "God, are you up there?" I said, "No, what do you want?" It was looking right up at my bedroom window, which I used to, back in those days, I would keep those things open, and he just didn't expect to hear that.
Just a side question on history. Can you think of anything that might be a special interest from a historical point of view?
For the building,
For
the church.
Church and its anything that had to do with the city or the state or any of that sort of thing?
Not necessarily. I just know that the church has grown tremendously since the days I moved in. It's taken over a lot more space, and it has a lot more people attending it, and it just keeps growing. So I can't think of any real historical event.
You think of anything else at all that we should say?
I look at my notes.
I think we probably pretty well.
We've covered most of the things that I can think of. Trying to think of any unusual things that might have happened. We've had one good thing is that I always appreciate here is that they tried to maintain the integrity of the building and haven't modernized it as some churches have done. They've kept even when they put the new extension out there, it matches the old building, and I really appreciate that. I think that's important to keep the structure, the integrity of the structure the way it was originally built.
I've always thought that they did a wonderful job, blending it right into the architecture, just as if it had been there all along.
Right, and that's what that's one of the things I really appreciate with this particular church, because some churches do things that, you know, add on a new section, it's all modern, it doesn't match the other one.
Yeah.
You know, that's what,
And you can always tell it was added.
yes.
Well, if you don't think of anything else, I have one last question. You have any idea where the original Cornerstone is?
Oh, that question. That question. Well, there's some doubt as that there really was an original.
There's a story in the newspaper about it. Name the people that brought things up to put in it.
If there, I have been around this building a number of times looking for that particular stone, and I've never come across it, so I don't know where it could be. If I've personally never seen it, I don't believe that I've seen it come back. But you're right, the stories are out there. And,
Yeah, it was in the newspaper, and the reporters had been there, and they put in some olives from Jerusalem, I believe, and
olive branches.
Olive branches.
Olive branches.
Okay.
The only thing, there is a plaque down in the front entrance that is a bronze plaque that was put there, which gives the architects and the original minister, Barton. It's possible that if you took that plaque off the wall, it might be behind that. There is another possibility, and I don't think this is, mostly the cornerstones were part of the building. They were actually part of the corner of the building. Back in the 80s, we had an accident. The drunk driver came down the street and hit the front of the building out here where the big stone steps are.
Oh, yes.
And did a lot of damage. Knocked that whole banister of the steps, tore it all up, and they had to bring in more stone from the original quarry to replace it and rebuild it. Now, I would not think that that's where the cornerstone was, but that if it was anywhere near there, it could have torn up the cornerstone. But that's the only thing I can think. Most of the improvements around the construction that's happened since I've been here would not have interfered with the cornerstone, I don't believe. That's a good question.
At this point, they're still actively looking for it.
Yes, they are. Bob Warner and I were out one day, walked around the building, prowling behind the bushes and trying to find it. But I just have no idea where that could be.
It's an interesting mystery.
And when you think about it, usually a cornerstone is put in a fairly prominent part of the building. Like the front of the building wouldn't be way around the back, I don't think. But there's just not any, and there hasn't been any construction that would take away from it. I mean, or take it away. It's a real mystery.
Yeah. Well, I think that's about all I have to ask at this point. We certainly do thank you for your time, and can't begin to thank you for all your stories. It's a whole different view of the church here that nobody else gets to see.
Interesting 38 years.
But we certainly appreciate your 38 years, and we appreciate your taking time to interview this morning. And I think I'd like to, like I said, I'd like to go down and let Joe take the camera down, and let's take some pictures of your pictures on the wall.
Thank you.
Okay, just a second here. We're ready to go. Go for what? Okay. It's on now.
This is the night picture taken across the street. And at that time, there was a house over there, and you see the trees. These trees are gone, but these are spotlights on that. It's a time delay picture because it was filmed, and the lighting was so low that you had to leave the camera on. And I like this one in the fog.
That's the one you're talking about. Oh, that is neat. It is very pretty. And I love the branch coming in there.
Yeah, those trees are maybe still there. That one might still be there. This one, these are gone. And this is the one I was telling you about. See the lighting coming onto the church there. And that one is...
and these were all three in 82, 1982.
82. Yeah, and the colors held up very well for color pictures.
So, have you focused in and gotten a pretty good shot of each one?
Well, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Those were done with the Cibachrome process, which is fairly what they call archival. And, see, if they'd been a Kodak, those would be faded
Oh, I see.
by now. But they are faded a bit, but the beauty of the Cibachrome is that the colors, all the colors fade at the same rate, so that if you were to take the matte off of them, you'd see that the original, where it has not been exposed to light, is still pretty
So did
intense.
that, the process have to do with the chemicals you used
Yes.
to
It was
develop? Did
it's
that-
when they came out with Cibachrome in the 80s, they realized that the color would hold its integrity for a long time. So they start calling those archival. They say it'll last 100 years.
Yeah. And how did that, the old, they used to call some of the old ones Kodachrome. How did that
Well,
compare?
Kodachromes, that's a transparency film,
Oh,
and this is a
Slides.
print film.
I
That's the
see.
difference.
okay.
Yeah.
But you're right, Kodachrome was a good quality
Uh-huh.
film.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's